The Whitmore estate had been silent for years, not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that suffocates. 3 little children lived inside its marble walls, born into silence the day their mother died, bringing them into the world. Liam, Caleb, and Sophia, triplets who had never spoken a word, never laughed loud enough to be heard. Their father, Alexander Whitmore, one of the wealthiest men in New York, believed no sound could ever break through the grief that bound them. But one afternoon, he stopped dead at the kitchen doorway. Music was playing. His children were moving. And the sight of what his maid was doing with them made his heart pound so hard he nearly screamed aloud. The Whitmore estate stood like a monument to sorrow. Its marble staircases gleamed, its chandeliers sparkled, its gardens were trimmed to perfection, and yet not a sound lived there. No laughter, no shouting, no playful footsteps echoing against its high ceilings. It was a house frozen, a palace that looked alive but breathed like a tomb. Inside, 3 children grew up in this silence. Liam, Caleb, and Sophia, the triplets who had never spoken a word loud enough to fill a room. Born deaf, their first breath of life had also been their mother's last. Isabella Whitmore had died on the day they arrived, leaving behind 3 swaddled infants and a husband who had no idea how to live without her. Their father, Alexander Whitmore, was a man the world envied. Billionaire. Visionary. Ruthless tycoon who built empires with his bare hands. But to his children, he was little more than a shadow moving between office and bedroom, carrying grief like a second skin. He provided everything, the best doctors, the finest therapists, the most expensive specialists, but nothing could penetrate the wall of silence. The children sat in their ornate chairs, eyes lowered, untouched by the riches around them. Every room in that house bore Isabella's ghost. The nursery she had decorated but never entered with them. The piano in the drawing room, where she once played Chopin with a smile so radiant that even Alexander had forgotten business for an evening. And the little music box he had locked away in his study, the one she had pressed to her belly while pregnant, whispering, "They'll dance before they can even walk." But they never danced. For 3 years, Alexander convinced himself it was impossible. That silence was their destiny, and grief was his punishment. His empire expanded while his home shrank into emptiness. He kept his children alive but never truly living, unable to face what he had lost, too afraid to believe in what he might still have. Until one afternoon, it happened. The sound came first, faint, impossible. A melody drifting down the corridor from the kitchen, warm and alive, a sound his ears had not heard in years. He stopped walking, certain his mind was betraying him. But then, over the faint notes, came something sharper. Laughter. High-pitched. Unmistakable. His blood ran cold. His children had never laughed like that. Not once. Heart pounding, Alexander followed the sound, every step slow, disbelieving. He gripped the doorway to steady himself. And there, inside the kitchen, the sight nearly knocked the breath from his chest. The maid, Elena Brooks, the woman he had barely noticed beyond her duties, was spinning in the middle of the room, her braids whipping around her shoulders, her arms outstretched like a conductor. Around her, Liam, Caleb, and Sophia stumbled clumsily on little feet, their bodies jerking out of rhythm, their mouths wide open in unrestrained giggles. Giggles. His children. Laughing. Dancing. The file Alexander had been holding slipped from his hand, forgotten. His vision blurred, his chest tightened with something violent, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Hope. And as he stood frozen in the doorway, his hands trembling, one thought consumed him: what on earth was she doing to his children, and how was it possible? Elena Brooks had been in the Whitmore estate for less than a month, but already she understood its rhythm, or rather, its lack of rhythm. The silence weighed on everything. Meals were eaten without a word. The children drifted through hallways like shadows, their eyes avoiding hers, their tiny hands clutching toys they never really played with. It broke her heart. Elena hadn't grown up with marble floors and chandeliers. Her childhood home had been noisy, crowded, messy, a little two-bedroom house in Queens where her mother's gospel hymns filled the kitchen every Sunday morning, where neighbors argued out their windows and children played tag on cracked sidewalks until dusk. Noise was her language. Music, laughter, even chaos, those were the signs of life to her. So when she stepped into the Whitmore kitchen each morning, greeted only by the quiet scrape of forks against plates and the flat gaze of three children who seemed locked away from the world, she felt a kind of frustration she couldn't shake. That day, something in her snapped. Liam sat at the small table, staring at the wall. Caleb lined his toy trucks in a perfect row but never pushed them. Sophia twirled a strand of her hair, eyes glassy, far away. Elena wanted to scream at the silence. Instead, she reached into her canvas bag and pulled out the one thing she always carried, a small, battered Bluetooth speaker. Her thumb hovered over the button. She knew Alexander Whitmore would not approve. He ran this house like a boardroom, all rules and routines, no room for surprises. But she wasn't thinking about him. She was thinking about the three children who looked like prisoners in their own skin. She pressed play. Aretha Franklin's voice filled the kitchen, rich and alive, sliding through the air like sunlight spilling across the cold marble. Elena's chest tightened, half in fear, half in hope. At first, nothing happened. Liam blinked, his head tilting slightly. Caleb's hands froze on his toy trucks. Sophia glanced up, her eyes flicking between Elena and the little speaker, confused. Then, the smallest thing, Liam's heel tapped against the chair leg. Once. Twice. A rhythm forming, imperfect but deliberate. Elena's heart skipped. Caleb slapped a palm against the table, his brows furrowed, but the corner of his mouth twitching upward. Sophia let out a squeak, high and fragile, before clapping both hands against her chest as if the sound had startled her. Elena swallowed hard, her instincts screaming not to stop. She set the speaker on the counter, and without thinking, she began to sway. Slowly at first, then bigger, her hips swinging, her arms rising with exaggerated drama. She twirled once, laughing softly. "Come on, little ones," she coaxed, though she knew they couldn't hear the words. Her smile and movement were the real language. Sophia's face changed first. She slid off her chair clumsily, her knees wobbly, but her eyes wide, daring. She stomped one foot, then another, copying Elena's rhythm. Liam's mouth opened, a soundless giggle spilling out, his small hands clapping once, then again. Caleb hesitated, biting his lip, until his brother tugged him forward. Soon, all three were moving, awkward and ungraceful, but alive. The kitchen, a place that had felt like a mausoleum, pulsed with life. Elena bent low, meeting them at their level, her braids swinging wildly as she spun. Liam reached out for her hand. Sophia laughed, really laughed, a shrill, broken, but beautiful sound. Caleb stomped so hard he nearly lost his balance, then erupted into a giggle that echoed against the tiled walls. Elena's throat tightened with emotion. She laughed too, tears burning behind her eyes as she gathered their little hands, swaying with them as if they were on a stage only the four of them could see. For the first time since she had arrived, Elena knew she had found the crack in their shell. Music. Not just sound, but vibration, rhythm, movement. Something they could feel, not just hear. And that was the moment Alexander appeared in the doorway, frozen. His children, his silent, unreachable children, were laughing. Dancing. Alive. And at the center of it all was the maid he had barely noticed. The file slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. Elena gasped, her smile faltering, her heart lurching into panic. But the triplets didn't stop. They laughed harder, tugging at her hands, stomping their little feet as if they had finally remembered what joy felt like. Alexander's chest rose and fell in jagged breaths. For 3 years he had lived in silence, convinced it was permanent. And now, here in his kitchen, it had been shattered. By her. Alexander Whitmore stood in the doorway like a man caught in a dream he couldn't explain. His chest rose and fell too fast, each breath shallow and ragged, as though he had been running for miles. Yet he hadn't moved. Liam twirled clumsily, his little arms spread wide. Sophia stomped both feet, squealing with laughter, her curls bouncing around her face. Caleb clung to Elena's hand, his mouth wide in a soundless laugh that made Alexander's vision blur. His children. Laughing. The sound hit him like a blow. He hadn't heard it since Isabella was alive. His wife's face flashed before his eyes, Isabella, 8 months pregnant, standing barefoot in the nursery. She had pressed that silver music box against her swollen belly, humming along to the delicate tune as though she could will their unborn children into rhythm. "They'll dance before they can even walk, Alex," she had whispered, her eyes bright with mischief. "They'll feel music in their bones." He had kissed her forehead that night, laughing softly, not knowing it would be the last time he ever saw her alive. And now, 3 years later, here it was. The very scene she had imagined. Their children, stumbling, clapping, moving to a rhythm they should not even be able to hear. A sound escaped Alexander's throat, low and broken, before he realized it. His hand pressed hard against his chest, as if to steady the ache ripping through him. For years he had convinced himself silence was safer. That if he buried Isabella's memory deep enough, he could protect the children from the weight of grief. That laughter would never come, and it was better not to expect it. But now. Elena twirled again, dropping low to match the children's height, her braids whipping around her. Sophia copied her spin and nearly toppled, but Caleb caught her clumsily, and the three of them collapsed into a heap of giggles so pure Alexander's knees weakened. He wanted to step inside. He wanted to grab them all, hold them, demand to know how this was possible. But his feet wouldn't move. Pride and disbelief rooted him to the floor. Then Liam spotted him. The boy froze mid-clap, his wide eyes locking on his father's frame in the doorway. For a second, silence threatened to descend again. Sophia followed her brother's gaze. Caleb too. All three children turned toward Alexander, their little bodies still trembling from laughter, their faces glowing red from movement. Alexander's breath caught. Would they retreat? Would they fold back into silence, undoing everything? But then Sophia did something that made his heart stop. She grinned, lifted both hands, and slapped them against her chest in a jerky, imperfect sign. Elena's eyes widened, recognizing it instantly. Dance. Sophia had signed a word. She had invited him in. Alexander staggered a step forward, his throat closing. His daughter, his silent daughter, was asking him to join her. His jaw clenched, torn between pride and the unbearable pull of hope. He shook his head, retreating into the only armor he had left. He turned abruptly and walked away, his footsteps heavy against the marble, his chest burning with something violent. Behind him, the laughter resumed, faint but real. But in Alexander's mind, it mingled with Isabella's voice, echoing through memory. They'll dance before they can even walk. Morning light slanted through the tall windows, spilling gold across the marble counters. The Whitmore mansion looked alive in its elegance, but the air was taut, fragile, waiting. Alexander hadn't slept. He had paced his study through the night, his mind circling back to one image he couldn't banish, Sophia's little hands forming that clumsy sign. Dance. His daughter had asked him to join her, and instead of stepping forward, he had fled. By sunrise, shame had curdled into anger. If he admitted the truth, that he had been afraid, it would break him. So instead, he dressed in his tailored suit, straightened his cuffs, and went downstairs determined to restore control. The triplets sat at the kitchen table, nibbling at toast under Elena's watchful eye. She moved with easy warmth, humming faintly as she buttered their bread. Caleb's little fingers tapped against the tabletop in a faint rhythm, and Sophia's lips curved upward as if the memory of laughter still lingered. It was too much. Elena. Alexander's voice cracked through the room like a whip. She glanced up, startled, though her gaze sharpened quickly. Mr. Whitmore. His jaw tightened. What exactly do you think you're doing with my children? Her brows knit, but she set down the butter knife calmly. Feeding them breakfast. Keeping them company. I'm not talking about breakfast, Alexander snapped, his tone harder than he intended. He moved closer, the air around him heavy. I saw you yesterday. Whatever that was, the music, the circus in my kitchen, it stops. Immediately. The triplets froze. Sophia's hand, halfway to her mouth, hovered in the air. Caleb's eyes darted nervously between his father and Elena. Liam slumped, withdrawing into himself. Elena noticed, and her lips pressed together before she spoke. They laughed yesterday. They moved. They lived. And you want that to stop? Alexander's fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't admit the truth, that the sound of their laughter had ripped through him like a blade. They don't need parlor tricks. They need structure. Therapy. Schedules. What you did was reckless. Reckless? Elena's voice rose slightly, not out of disrespect, but conviction. She braced one hand on the counter, her dark eyes locking on his. With respect, Mr. Whitmore, joy is not reckless. It's the only thing your children have been starved of. The words pierced him, sharper than any boardroom challenge. He opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came. Because deep inside, he knew she was right. The silence that followed stretched so thin it threatened to snap. Finally, Alexander forced himself to speak, his voice lower but still trembling with pride. You are overstepping. Elena inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She softened her tone but not her stance. I'm not trying to replace doctors. I'm not even pretending I have their knowledge. But I see your children as more than a diagnosis. Yesterday, they let me in. That means something, whether you want to admit it or not. The words hung in the air, thick with truth. Alexander's chest tightened. He wanted to shout her down, to reassert control, but instead his throat burned. Images of his children stomping their feet, clapping their hands, Sophia's imperfect sign for dance, they rose unbidden, betraying him. He turned sharply, his voice gravelly. Enough. Do your job. Nothing more. Elena's lips parted, hurt flashing across her face, but she said nothing. She only turned back to the children, her hand gentle as she brushed Caleb's hair from his eyes. The triplets leaned into her as though instinctively seeking protection, their small shoulders stiff. Alexander saw it and felt a sharp, cutting pang he couldn't name. Jealousy. Or maybe shame. He left the kitchen before his own children could see his hands trembling. That evening, the mansion seemed heavier than usual. Alexander had buried himself in his office, hiding behind contracts and numbers he wasn't really reading. The children sat quietly in the playroom, their toys untouched. The silence felt like punishment, the echo of words spoken too harshly in the kitchen that morning. Elena moved through the house quietly, tidying the chaos no one else seemed to notice. She had learned quickly that order here was not a sign of care, but of emptiness. The absence of fingerprints on glass, of toys scattered on the floor, of voices rising and falling, that was what haunted these walls. As she gathered blocks from under a chair, her eyes drifted upward to a high shelf in the living room. Something small and dust-covered caught her attention. She stretched on tiptoe, fingers brushing against the frame, and pulled it down. It was a photograph. The glass was smudged, the silver frame dulled with time, but the image inside was radiant. A younger Alexander stood with his arm wrapped protectively around a woman whose smile was brighter than the chandelier above her. Isabella Whitmore. Her eyes sparkled with warmth, her laugh seemed frozen in the picture itself. Elena's breath caught. She had never seen Isabella, but in this single image, she understood everything, the grief, the silence, the way Alexander walked like a man with a ghost chained to his ankle. For a long moment, she only stared. Then, quietly, reverently, she wiped the dust away with the hem of her sleeve. She knew instinctively this photograph didn't belong on a forgotten shelf. It belonged where the children could see it. So she placed it lower, on the mantel within their reach. The next morning, it happened. Liam wandered into the living room first, his small fingers trailing against the couch cushions. He stopped suddenly, eyes narrowing at the picture on the mantel. He tilted his head, studying the woman's face, something about her features stirring recognition he couldn't explain. Caleb joined him, his toy car in hand, but it slipped to the floor as soon as he saw the photograph. Sophia toddled in last, her curls messy, and froze when she noticed her brothers staring. For a long moment, all three stood shoulder to shoulder, gazing at the woman in the frame. Then Liam reached out a tentative finger and tapped the glass. His lips moved, but no sound came. Instead, he raised his little hands and shaped a clumsy sign. Mama. Elena's throat tightened so hard she thought she might choke. Caleb tried next, fumbling with the gesture, his tiny fingers awkward but determined. Sophia copied them both, her movements jerky, but when she looked up at Elena, her eyes were wide, shining with recognition they shouldn't have had but somehow did. Elena dropped to her knees beside them, her voice trembling. Yes, babies. That's your mama. She was beautiful, wasn't she? The triplets didn't answer in words, but their faces softened, their little bodies leaning into the photograph as if trying to touch the love it carried. And that was the moment Alexander walked in. He stopped dead. His briefcase slid from his hand and thudded to the carpet. His children stood in front of Isabella's photograph, their small hands raised, shaping the word he had forbidden himself to speak for years. Mama. His chest seized. He wanted to shout, to demand who had put that photo there, to protect them from the ache of remembering. But then Liam, turned toward him. The boy lifted his hands again, repeating the sign. Mama. Alexander's throat burned. His knees buckled as though the weight of memory had driven him down. For the first time since Isabella's funeral, tears gathered hot and unrelenting in his eyes. Yes, he whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking. That's Mama. Liam pressed his hand to the glass again, Caleb leaned against Alexander's leg, and Sophia tilted her little head, signing the word once more. And Alexander broke. His shoulders shook, his hand covering his face as grief and love collided in a storm he could no longer contain. The children didn't flinch. They clung to him instead, their small arms wrapping around his knees as if they'd been waiting years for this moment. From the doorway, Elena watched quietly, her own eyes stinging with tears. She hadn't meant to intrude. But as she stood there, witnessing father and children tethered at last by a name, she knew she had done the right thing. For the first time in years, Isabella's presence wasn't a ghost hidden on a shelf. She was alive in the hearts of her children. And Alexander knew he could never bury her again. The storm of that morning had left Alexander shaken. For years he had lived with silence as his armor, convinced it was the only way to survive. Now, the word Mama had returned to his house, not from his lips, but from his children's tiny hands. And it had undone him. That night, long after the triplets were asleep, Elena sat cross-legged on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, a notebook open on her lap. Scribbled sketches filled its pages, drawings of hands, arrows pointing to finger positions, single words underlined 3 times, play, happy, love. By the dim glow of her lamp, she practiced again and again, moving her hands awkwardly, whispering the words under her breath. She wasn't a trained therapist, and she knew Alexander would scoff if he saw her. But she had something no degree could give her, faith. She believed those children deserved a language they could feel in their bones. Her hands faltered, her fingers cramped, but she pushed through. For them. The next morning, she put her practice to the test. The triplets were restless, their blocks scattered across the floor in uneven towers. Elena knelt down, her notebook hidden nearby, and caught their attention with an exaggerated smile. She lifted her hands slowly, carefully, and shaped her fingers into a sign. Play. Her lips moved with it, her eyes sparkling, her expression full of invitation. Liam blinked. Caleb tilted his head. Sophia leaned forward, watching intently. Then, like a spark catching flame, Liam mimicked the gesture, clumsy but unmistakable. Caleb slapped his hands together in frustration, then tried again, his little brow furrowed in determination. Sophia clapped, her whole face lighting up when Elena nodded in encouragement. Yes. Elena cheered softly, tears pressing against her lashes. That's it. That's play. The children giggled, their small fingers fumbling through the gesture again, their pride radiating. Elena tried another. She pressed her hand gently to her chest, her smile soft, her voice hushed. Happy. Sophia copied first, tapping her chest too quickly, then erupting into laughter as if the meaning fit perfectly. Liam tried, his little hand missing the shape, but his eyes shone. Caleb's attempt was sloppy, but when Elena kissed his forehead in approval, his chest puffed with pride. You're beautiful, she whispered, hugging them close. From the doorway, Alexander had been watching. He had come to summon Elena, his mind already rehearsing a reprimand, but the sight before him froze him in place. His children, once mute and unreachable, were signing. Their lips moving, their faces animated with joy. And it wasn't a doctor, or a specialist, or a therapist who had given them this. It was her. Elena noticed him then. Their eyes met, and though she said nothing, her hands shaped one final word. Love. She crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze soft as she whispered it aloud, love. The triplets scrambled to copy her. Liam's arms tangled awkwardly, Caleb pressed too hard against his chest, Sophia giggled through her attempt. But they did it. And for the first time in his life, Alexander felt the ground shift beneath him. He wanted to run, to retreat into the safety of denial. But then Caleb turned. His little fingers tugged at Alexander's sleeve, dragging him forward. Sophia pointed, signing again with a grin. Liam raised both arms high, his eyes demanding something Alexander wasn't sure he had left to give. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. Try. Just one word. Alexander's mouth went dry. His hands trained to sign contracts, to build empires, shook violently as he lifted them. He formed the shape clumsily, uncertain, his throat tightening as he spoke the word aloud. Papa. The reaction was immediate. Sophia squealed, clapping her hands. Caleb gasped, his mouth forming the broken syllables, Papa. Liam laughed so hard he toppled sideways, then scrambled up, signing the word back with fierce determination. Alexander's chest cracked open. For years he had been a shadow in their lives, watching from the outside. Now, in one trembling gesture, his children pulled him inside their world. Papa, Liam said again, louder this time, his voice thin but real. Caleb echoed him, Sophia stomped her feet with joy, and the three of them threw themselves into their father's arms. Alexander staggered, catching them, his eyes burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He held them close, his lips against their hair, his hands signing the word over and over. Papa. 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 The word no longer belonged to grief. It belonged to them. For days after that moment, Alexander carried the word Papa like a fragile flame cupped in his hands. He replayed it in his mind 1,000 times, Sophia's squeal, Liam's clumsy sign, Caleb's trembling syllables. Every night, he half feared it would vanish with the dawn, a trick of grief and exhaustion. But each morning, his children proved him wrong. They greeted him with outstretched hands, their small fingers fumbling through signs, their lips struggling with sounds. Elena guided them patiently, turning every chore into a lesson. Folding laundry became a chance to practice soft and warm. Washing dishes became water and bubbles. Even bedtime, once an ordeal of tears and silence, was transformed. The children signed story, and Alexander found himself reading aloud again, his voice cracking as little eyes widened with delight. But doubt stalked him. He had paid experts, the finest in the country, and each had told him the same: progress would be slow, if it came at all. And yet here, under Elena's care, the children were changing daily. It was miraculous, and terrifying. Because if it was real, then what did it say about him, the father who had given up too soon? So when Dr. Harold Stein, the pediatric neurologist who had overseen the triplets since birth, scheduled his quarterly visit, Alexander seized the chance. Proof. He needed proof that this wasn't a fantasy. The morning of the visit, Alexander paced the living room like a man awaiting judgment. His jaw was tight, his hands clasped behind his back. Elena tried to reassure him with a quiet, "They'll show him who they are," but he silenced her with a curt, "We'll see." When the doctor arrived, his presence filled the room with authority. Silver-haired, sharp-eyed, his voice calm but clinical. He greeted the children with polite detachment, crouching to meet their gaze, then glanced at his clipboard. "Shall we begin?" Alexander crouched beside Liam, his voice low, coaxing. "Show him, son. Show Dr. Stein what you can do." Liam hesitated, glancing nervously at the stranger's pen and paper. His small hands twitched, half forming a sign, then faltered. Caleb shrank back, burying his face in Elena's side. Sophia tugged at her curls, frozen. "Go on," Alexander urged, too sharply. "You can do it. Show him Papa." But the harder he pressed, the more rigid they became. Silence swallowed the room. Dr. Stein cleared his throat softly. "Children often mimic gestures in play. It doesn't necessarily indicate meaningful progress." Alexander's head snapped toward him, fury in his eyes. "They're not mimicking. They're communicating. They're laughing. Engaging. Things they've never done before." The doctor's gaze was steady but unyielding. "I don't want you confusing moments of bonding with measurable development. False hope can be damaging." The words landed like a hammer. Elena flinched, her arms tightening around Caleb. Liam's lip trembled. Sophia buried her face in her dress. Alexander's chest burned with humiliation. He had paraded his children like exhibits, desperate for validation, and they had folded back into silence under the weight of scrutiny. Rage surged, wild and directionless. He turned on the only person who had given him this dangerous hope. "This is your doing," he spat, his voice like a blade. Elena's eyes widened. "Mine. You filled their heads with illusions. Tricks. You make them laugh, you teach them gestures, and you convince me it's progress. But when it matters, when it counts, they collapse. You've given me false hope." The venom in his tone was as much self-loathing as accusation. But it landed on her like a blow. Elena rose slowly, her hand stroking Caleb's hair as he clung to her. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of steel. "Hope is not an illusion, Mr. Whitmore. It's the only thing that's kept them alive in this house." She tapped her chest, then gestured to the children. "You think reports and charts will raise them? You think statistics will teach them to trust, to laugh, to look you in the eye? No. What they need is someone who believes in them. What they need is faith." Her words cracked something inside him, but pride locked his jaw. He turned away, his silence more brutal than shouting. The rest of the day, the mansion felt colder than it had in years. The mansion had not felt this cold in years. Not since the funeral. After the doctor's visit, silence wrapped itself around every room like a punishment. Alexander buried himself in his office, working late into the night, his pride refusing to let Elena's words echo in his head, even though they did. Elena still cared for the children with quiet patience, but her laughter was gone, her gestures measured, her voice soft and restrained. And the triplets felt it most. They clung to her constantly, refusing to let her out of sight. Their play grew timid again, their giggles rare. Sometimes they stared toward their father's study door, their little hands twitching with signs they no longer dared to use. By Thursday evening, the air was heavy with a grief too familiar. Dinner had ended quietly. Elena cleared dishes, her movements slow, the children hovering at her feet as though afraid she might vanish. She reached for her bag on the chair when Liam spotted it. The speaker. His eyes lit instantly. Without hesitation, he tugged it free and set it gently on the kitchen floor like a treasure. Caleb knelt beside him, pressing the button with small, eager fingers. Sophia clapped once, squealing in delight when the blue light blinked alive. A beat later, music spilled into the kitchen, clumsy, tinny, but enough. Elena froze. Her chest tightened. She hadn't dared play music since Alexander's outburst. But the children, they were already moving. Liam stomped his heel in rhythm. Caleb slapped his palms against the floor. Sophia spun clumsily, her curls flying, her laughter bursting free like it had been locked in a cage. They turned to her, eyes shining, hands outstretched. Elena's throat tightened. For a moment, she hesitated, Alexander's angry words still sharp in her memory. But then Liam clapped again, Caleb giggled, and Sophia ran straight to her, tugging at her skirt, begging without words. She couldn't refuse them. So Elena took a breath, pushed aside her fear, and stepped into their circle. She twirled once, then dropped low, stomping her feet with exaggerated rhythm. The triplets squealed louder, stomping with her, their little bodies jerking in delight. Their laughter filled the kitchen again, brighter than the chandelier above them. And upstairs, Alexander heard it. He had promised himself he wouldn't interfere. That he would let the evening pass like all the others. But the sound was undeniable. Laughter. Real, unrestrained, alive. His pen slipped from his hand. Against his own will, his feet carried him down the stairs, each step tightening the knot in his chest. When he reached the kitchen doorway, he froze. The scene hit him like lightning. Elena spun in the center, braids whipping, her face radiant with joy. The triplets danced around her, clapping, stomping, giggling until their voices cracked. The marble floors shook with their tiny feet. The air shimmered with life. And then it happened. All three children turned at once. They saw him standing there. And with wide eyes, trembling little hands, they signed together, jerky, imperfect, but unmistakable. Dance, Papa. Alexander's breath caught. His knees nearly gave. They had never invited him like this before. Not once. And now three pairs of eyes burned into him, waiting, pleading. Dance, Papa. For a moment, panic gripped him. He was Alexander Whitmore, billionaire, man of control. He didn't dance. He didn't look foolish. And yet his children had just given him the one invitation he had been waiting 3 years to hear. Elena turned too, her gaze soft, steady, urging him without a word. Alexander's throat burned. His chest felt like it would split. And then, for the first time in years, he let go. He stepped forward. Slowly, awkwardly, he raised his arms and swayed in rhythm. At first it was clumsy, stiff, but the triplets squealed with delight, stomping harder, clapping faster. Caleb rushed to grab his hand. Sophia tugged at his jacket until he spun her clumsily. Liam laughed so hard he toppled onto the floor, rolling with joy. And then Alexander laughed too. The sound burst from him raw, uncontained, tearing through his chest like thunder. He crouched low, spinning with them, stomping until his polished shoes scuffed the marble. His children wrapped around him, three little bodies clinging to him, their giggles and squeals filling the kitchen until he thought the roof might lift. For the first time in years, Alexander Whitmore screamed for joy. And in that moment, he wasn't a billionaire, or a widower, or a man haunted by ghosts. He was just Papa. The house should have been quiet after the children went to bed, but it wasn't. Not really. Their laughter still clung to the air, echoing faintly in the hallways, softening every shadow. For the first time in years, the Whitmore estate felt alive. But Alexander couldn't sleep. He sat in his study long after midnight, the amber light of a single lamp casting deep hollows under his eyes. His desk was bare save for one drawer he hadn't touched in 3 years. His hand hovered above it, shaking. He told himself to leave it closed, safer that way. But the memory of his children's little hands signing dance, Papa burned hotter than his fear. Finally, he slid the drawer open. Inside lay a single envelope, its edges yellowed, its seal unbroken. He picked it up with trembling fingers. He didn't need to open it, he knew every word by heart. He had written it 2 weeks after Isabella's death, sitting outside the nursery door while his triplets wailed and he sat paralyzed, unable to go in. Dearest Isabella, he had written, I don't know how to be what they need. I can barely look at them without drowning. I fear they will grow up knowing only my silence, never my love. And maybe that would be kinder, because I don't know if I have any love left to give. His throat burned. He had never mailed it, never shown it to anyone. It was the one confession of his failure he couldn't bear the world to see. But tonight, he couldn't keep it hidden anymore. Almost against his will, his legs carried him down the hall to Elena's room. He stood at her door for a long moment, his chest heaving. Then, with a knock softer than a breath, he waited. The door opened. Elena stood in the glow of a bedside lamp, wearing a simple shirt and sweatpants, her eyes widening when she saw him, Alexander Whitmore, unshaven, exhausted, clutching an envelope like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I wrote this, he said, his voice raw. A long time ago. For Isabella. I never sent it. Her brows furrowed, but she stepped aside, silent, giving him space. He walked in, handed her the letter, and turned away, unable to watch her read. The room was quiet save for the faint scratch of paper as she unfolded it. Her eyes moved slowly, carefully, drinking in each word. Her breath caught once, then again. When she finished, her hands trembled as she folded it back, holding it as if it were something sacred. She looked up at him, her voice soft but certain. She would have been proud of you. Alexander shook his head violently, his jaw tight. Proud? For what? For failing them? For hiding from them? Elena stepped closer, her gaze steady. Not for your money. Not for your empire. Proud because you're still here. Because you stayed. Because you tried when every part of you wanted to give up. His lips parted, but no words came. She placed the letter gently back into his hand. You didn't give up on them. Or yourself. That's what matters. Alexander's throat burned, his chest heaving. And then Elena did something he never expected. She reached up and cupped his face, not romantic, not bold, but tender, reverent, as if she understood the weight he carried and refused to flinch. You were never supposed to be enough alone, she whispered. No one is. His eyes closed. For the first time in years, he let someone see the pain he had kept buried under marble and silence. He didn't cry, not yet, but his breath came ragged, his body trembling under the release of finally being understood. They sat side by side on the edge of her bed, not touching, not speaking. They didn't need words. In her gaze, he didn't see pity. He saw recognition. Shared grief. Shared strength. When he finally rose to leave, he looked back at her, the letter clutched in his hand. Thank you, he said, the words heavier than they seemed. Their eyes held, no longer employer and employee, but two souls carrying the same fragile truth. Sometimes healing doesn't look heroic. Sometimes it looks like staying. Spring crept quietly into the Whitmore estate. The icy weight of winter melted into softer mornings, and though no one dared to speak it aloud, the air inside the mansion was different too. Lighter. Less suffocating. Elena had been planning something for weeks, a small experiment she kept tucked in her imagination until the first true warm day arrived. That morning, while the children ate their breakfast, she slipped outside and began laying a trail through the garden. Bright ribbons in red, yellow, blue, and green, tied to slim wooden stakes, fluttered in the breeze. They wound across the grass like a rainbow path leading nowhere but forward. By the time she returned inside, her cheeks flushed, the triplets were waiting with wide eyes. She knelt down, signing as best she could. Walk. Colors. One step, then another. They didn't fully understand, but their excitement was palpable. Liam was the first to step onto the grass, cautious, his small legs wobbling. Caleb followed close behind, his brow furrowed with concentration, clutching his toy car even as he toddled forward. Sophia squealed with delight, racing ahead with no fear, her curls bouncing, her little hands reaching for the ribbons. Elena followed at a distance, not guiding, not correcting, only watching, only ready to catch them if they fell. On the porch, Alexander stood frozen, one hand gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles whitened. He hadn't known about this. Elena hadn't asked. She rarely did anymore. She simply trusted the children, and herself. He wanted to call out, to stop them before they tripped and hurt themselves. But something in him held back. Instead, he watched. His breath caught as Sophia stumbled, falling hard on her knees. For a moment, his body jerked forward, ready to rush to her. But before he could move, she laughed. A high, broken laugh, and pushed herself up, brushing off the grass as if nothing had happened. Caleb copied her, tumbling forward, then popping back up. Liam giggled, clapping his hands at his siblings' clumsy bravery. Alexander's throat burned. His children weren't fragile porcelain. They were alive. Stumbling. Falling. Rising again. And then, it happened. Liam stopped in the middle of the path and turned toward the porch. His eyes searched for his father. When he found him, his face split into a grin. Slowly, deliberately, he raised both hands and shaped a clumsy sign. "Come, Papa." Alexander's chest seized. Sophia caught on quickly, her little hands mimicking the sign with wild enthusiasm. Caleb followed, jerky but determined. 3 pairs of eyes locked on him, 3 sets of hands reaching out, their voices breaking the air in uneven echoes. "Papa." His knees nearly gave out. For 3 years, he had convinced himself they didn't want him. That they couldn't reach him. That silence was all they had to offer. And now, here they were, not just inviting him, but calling him forward with every ounce of their being. His feet moved before his pride could stop them. Down the steps, across the grass, faster, until he was running, not the graceful stride of a tycoon, but the stumbling gait of a father desperate to reach his children. He dropped to his knees in the middle of the rainbow path, his arms flung wide. They collided with him at once, 3 small bodies pressing against his chest. Liam's fingers dug into his shirt, Caleb buried his face in his shoulder, Sophia squealed, wrapping her arms around his neck. And Alexander broke. A sob ripped from his chest, raw and uncontained. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched them tighter than he ever had before. "Papa," he signed again and again, his hands shaking, his lips whispering the word like a prayer. The children copied him, their little fingers clumsy but determined. "Papa." They cried, their voices imperfect but loud enough to fill the garden, to shatter the last of the silence that had smothered the Whitmore estate. Elena stood a few feet back, her hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes glistening. She didn't intrude. She didn't speak. She only watched as the man who had once buried himself in grief let himself be reborn in the arms of his children. The garden seemed to hold its breath. Then, softly, Alexander lifted his head. His eyes found Elena's across the path. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. She saw it in the way he held his children, in the way his body bent to fit theirs, in the way his tears mingled with their laughter. The Whitmore mansion had been silent for 3 years. But here, in the Garden of Colors, life roared back. Months had passed since the day in the garden, but Alexander still carried the memory like a jewel in his pocket. Whenever his mind turned dark, whenever grief threatened to claw him back under, he remembered the feel of his children's arms clutching him, their voices calling him Papa, their signs demanding his presence. The Whitmore mansion was unrecognizable now. No longer a mausoleum, it pulsed with energy. Toys cluttered the staircases, drawings decorated the refrigerator, and laughter echoed daily against marble walls that once felt like stone. Alexander no longer observed from the periphery. He joined. He played. He signed. And Elena, she remained the quiet current beneath it all, guiding without force, shaping without pride, steady as the heartbeat that carried them forward. So one warm evening, Alexander made a decision no one expected. He invited people in. It wasn't a gala. Not one of his grand banquets where chandeliers glittered above strings of pearls. No. This was smaller. Humble, almost. A handful of neighbors who had glimpsed the triplets on their walks, a few close friends, and the therapists who had charted years of struggle. In the garden, under the fading light, Elena laid out a simple table. The triplets had helped her bake, muffins lopsided, cookies dented with tiny fingerprints. They displayed their creations proudly, eyes shining as guests gathered. The children darted across the grass, Sophia in a too-big sun hat, Caleb with his toy car tucked in his pocket, Liam clutching a crumpled drawing of a rainbow path. They ran without fear, signed excitedly, tugged at sleeves, pointed at their treasures. The guests watched in awe. "Are they signing?" one whispered. "Look at them, look how engaged," another murmured, eyes wide, tears brimming. Even Dr. Stein, the once skeptical neurologist, stood at the edge of the lawn, his clipboard forgotten, his lips parted in disbelief as Sophia clapped her hands and shouted, "Papa!" Across the grass. Alexander froze, then looked up, meeting the doctor's stunned gaze with a pride he no longer felt ashamed of. He opened his arms, and all 3 children barreled into him, knocking him backward onto the grass as guests laughed and cried. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't for validation. It was life, raw and unfiltered, playing out in front of eyes that had once only seen charts and diagnoses. From the shade of an oak tree, Elena adjusted a tray the wind had knocked askew. She stood quietly, not seeking attention. But Alexander saw her. He crossed the lawn, the children still tugging at his hands, dirt on their knees, icing smudged on their cheeks. He stopped before her, holding 2 cups of lemonade, and pressed one into her hand. For a moment, neither spoke. The children laughed nearby, guests applauded softly, and the evening air hummed with something sacred. Then Alexander turned to her, his voice low but steady. "You brought them back to me. And you brought me back to them." Elena blinked, her breath catching, but she only nodded, her hand brushing his arm lightly. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was recognition. Gratitude. A bond forged in struggle and softened in love. The triplets rushed over, tugging at both of them now. Sophia grabbed Elena's hand, Caleb clung to his father's leg, Liam tugged insistently at their sleeves. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Together, Alexander and Elena allowed themselves to be pulled down onto a blanket spread beneath the tree. Cookies passed from hand to hand, crumbs scattering. Giggles tangled with Alexander's low chuckle and Elena's laugh, bright and unguarded. The guests stood back, watching in reverent silence, as the family that had once been defined by grief rewrote itself before their eyes. For years, the Whitmore mansion had been a symbol of power and wealth. Now, it was something far greater. A home reborn, not by marble and gold, but by laughter, trust, and the courage to believe again. The evening sky deepened into violet, stars beginning to flicker above the Whitmore estate. The guests had gone, their murmurs of awe lingering in the air, but the garden remained alive with the sound of children. Sophia had curled up against Elena's side, her too big sun hat slipping over her eyes. Caleb lay sprawled across Alexander's lap, his toy car still clutched tightly in his hand. Liam sat cross-legged between them, scribbling uneven shapes across a crumpled napkin, pausing every few seconds to tug at his father's sleeve and sign proudly, "Look, Papa." Alexander obeyed every time. He leaned in, nodding solemnly at crooked rainbows and lopsided stick figures, as though they were masterpieces worthy of framing. He didn't care that his tailored suit was smeared with grass and cookie crumbs. He didn't care that his polished shoes had been scuffed raw by stomping on marble. For once, he wasn't the billionaire, the widower, the man everyone whispered about. He was just Papa. Elena reached across, brushing a crumb from Caleb's cheek. Their eyes met briefly, and Alexander felt a wave of gratitude so fierce it almost unsteadied him. He remembered the first day he had seen her, just a maid hired to keep the house running, invisible against the backdrop of his empire. And now, she had become the axis on which his family turned. He thought of Isabella then, not with the suffocating weight of grief, but with a softer ache. She had dreamed their children would dance before they could walk. And tonight, they had. He wished she could see it. But perhaps, in some way, she had. The children stirred, Sophia signing love clumsily across her chest. Caleb copied, smacking his little fists too hard. Liam, determined, pressed both arms over his shirt until his whole body shook with effort. Alexander's throat tightened. He mirrored the sign slowly, his large hands trembling as he shaped the word. Love. The children beamed, squealing, collapsing into him with giggles muffled against his chest. Elena watched with tears brimming, her hand pressed to her mouth. Alexander looked up at the sky, his voice cracking but certain. They'll never know silence again. Not while I'm here. The wind stirred the ribbons still tied along the garden path, their colors fluttering like banners of victory. The mansion that had once been a tomb of silence now echoed with laughter, stomps, giggles, and clumsy words. Wealth had once been Alexander's fortress, but tonight he understood its truth, marble and gold meant nothing. The true empire was here, in tiny arms clutching his neck, in Elena's quiet strength, in the soundless laughter that healed wounds deeper than money ever could. As the stars blinked awake overhead, the Whitmore family sat together beneath the oak tree, messy, imperfect, reborn. And for the first time in 3 years, Alexander Whitmore believed in tomorrow.